Uachtaráin an Dr. Jim Brown, Ambassador na Breataine Dominic Chilcott, or Banial of Vice Accounts, Ní Sternley, a chard a gael. Balloyeri agus huair géad míle fáilt fad, chuig an sesiún díspóireachta seo Brexit. My name is Eimear Ni Chonaola from NUI TG and I'm delighted to be here today at my old alma mater, the National University of Ireland, Galway, for this afternoon session on Brexit, which is being hosted by NUI Galway in association with the British Embassy in Ireland, with support from European Movement Ireland. Now, in a little over 5 weeks' time, on the 23rd of June, the United Kingdom's 65 million inhabitants will vote on whether Britain leaves the EU or remains in the EU. It's a momentous decision for the UK, and it's of particular interest in Ireland too, as the only EU country with which the UK shares a land border. Our panelists today, Professor John McHale, Fine Gael MEP Mairéad McGuinness, David Begg, Director of TASC, Noelle O'Connell from European Movement, and Conall MacCoille, Chief Economist with Davy Research. They'll all outline their own views on the upcoming referendum and will later debate the issues more thoroughly. Tá céad míle fáilte rúbar fad anseo, and it's great that you could make it here today. I'd like to welcome our audience here today, as well as our audience all around the world, as this event is being streamed live on www.nuigalway.ie/live. Ach a dosach báide, gan na hille muile. Bhálum go gurach sib fáilte mhór bhíh uachtar an ollscoil na héad Gailen Dr. Jim Brown a chud is tús le himachtaí an lei. A uachtaráin.
Garmagad Eimear, a cordja, a colacatha, agus ina spisialta, while her maduas, Mairéad míle fáilte choróibh go léir go dtí an ócáid súnsaach seo, agus an díosbrógach fear táhachtach seo. Agus tá anás an go chance agamsa focail rálibh rev an díosbróg sin. So just to say, first of all, you're very welcome to this very important discussion on Brexit, and I'm delighted to have had a chance to say a few words to you at the beginning of it. So let me recognise Ambassador Chilcott, the colleagues from the University member of Governing Authority, colleagues and visitors. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to welcome you to this discussion on Britain's place in the European Union. And a special event, as Eimear, a special welcome, as Eimear has said, to colleagues around the world who are watching this via the internet through live stream. And we're very pleased to have that facility to allow us to have this debate, if you like, broadcast to those who wish to see it around the world. Clearly, the decision that Britain now faces is a historic decision. It's one which matters to all of Europe, but especially it matters to this country. We're the only EU country, as Eimear has said, which shares a land border with the United Kingdom, and therefore the debate has been followed with particular interest in this country. I think we're very fortunate to have a panel this afternoon of people who have a lot to say and a lot of interesting things to say about this issue, and who will discuss the consequences of a possible Brexit from an economic and political point of view. And I want to also welcome Professor John McHale, who's the director of our Whitaker Institute and also chairman of the Irish Fiscal Council, Mairéad McGuinness, Fine Gael MEP for Midlands North West and also Vice President of the European Parliament, David Begg from TASC, who also chairs the Pension Board and indeed is a former General Secretary of ICTU, Noelle O'Connell from the European Movement Ireland, Conall MacCoille, who's the Chief Economist with Davy Stockbrokers and Davy Research, and also our moderator, Eimear Ni Chonaola. I'm delighted that the Ambassador is here today, and he will address you in a moment about this important topic. In fact, it's more or less a year to the day since he was here at another event. I don't have a tremendous memory, but I will not forget that event. That was the event where their Royal Highnesses, the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall, joined us with the Ambassador in this very room on the 19th of May last year. That was a tremendous day for the university, and one which will long live in our memories. So, today we're in a building that's 170 years old. It's at the very heart of the university. And this university goes back to what was originally Queen's College Galway. And Queen's College Galway, in turn, was part of a major investment by the then British government in Ireland in 3 universities in Belfast, Galway and Cork. And that investment took place at the height of the famine, a time of real austerity, in the true sense of the word austerity. And that investment has been transformative for our region, and in my view has made a huge difference to our region. In some ways, it captures the relationship that Ireland has with Britain. Many aspects of Irish public life have been assimilated from Britain. Many of our structures, many of our practices have been borrowed or adopted from our neighbours and have continued to grow and develop in the context of our independence and also our membership of the European Union. Since the 1840s, this university has flourished. People have emerged from it who have gone on to make a difference in our society, to help build our economy, to help to contribute to the development of our country, and indeed our countries outside of Ireland, including Britain. And many of our graduates find themselves in Britain. Tonight, in fact, I'm going to London for an event tomorrow in the Irish Embassy where we will meet with graduates from this university who are now based in London. And there are 3,000 Galway graduates, as far as we can see, based in England, of which about 1,000 are based in London. So for all of our alumni, for our staff and for our students, the relationship with Britain is very real. It's a relationship which has very important practical significance for us. Graduate mobility, employability, student recruitment, a shared qualifications framework, all testify to the benefits which our students gain from Ireland's participation in the European Union and Ireland's relationship with Britain. Many of our academic and research staff collaborate with British universities through the EU funding programmes. The Horizon 2020 programme, for example, where this university has had tremendous success in recent years. Many of our partners in those projects are British universities and British companies. Those partnerships are important to us because they allow us to work to create innovation, to create research breakthroughs, ultimately to create discoveries and ultimately wealth and jobs. And I would say for the university sector in Ireland, a change in Britain's relationship with the European Union would have consequences which are not desirable. Certainly our research partnerships with British universities and British companies would be damaged, or potentially would be damaged. I'm also very conscious of the fact that as I think about this event, going back to our history, that this institution was founded by the then British government in one of the most peripheral regions of Europe. And this institution has triumphed despite that peripherality. This university has now gone on to compete nationally and internationally. And I think it's interesting to reflect on the role that Europe and European enterprise has played in that. The vision of Europe, which is one where strong and weaker countries come together, coexist harmoniously, was pioneered by John Monnet in the mid-1950s. His vision, which was to bind together the wounds of some of the most blood-stained countries in the world and transform Europe into a place of peace, prosperity, and democracy, has certainly been facilitated by the emergence of common policies and shared structures. I believe that Europe has offered a way for Ireland as an independent state to relate through a politically innovative framework with Britain. I believe Europe has allowed Ireland to move beyond our history and our politically complicated, let's put it that way, past, and develop a new paradigm in our relationship with Britain. I believe that Britain and Ireland have both gained tremendously from our joint membership of the European community. I think it's a fact that our relationship has matured in the period since we joined the European Union, and the European Union has certainly facilitated the maturing of that relationship between our two countries. There are two interesting seanachal as Gaeilge. One, ní neart go chur le chéile. There is strength in working together. I think that applies to Britain and Ireland, and indeed applies to the broader European project. There's also another interesting seanachal, which Michael D. Higgins used recently, a scá chéile a bhair na daoine. People live in each other's shadows. And we do live in each other's shadows as individuals and as countries. Europe has helped to make Ireland and Britain more prosperous, more competitive, and ultimately more affluent. For Britain to consider leaving the European Union would weaken the European Union. It's one of Europe's most important members, and we would lose much of what is our collective strength. However, we also know that regardless of what happens in the UK around the Brexit debate, Ireland's relationship with Britain is very important and needs to remain very important and remains very strong. And I'm sure the bonds that the binds that join us will continue. We have a shared culture, effectively a shared common language. Our people are connected through centuries of migration and settlement, and our two nations will continue to remain interconnected, whatever happens to the European Union in terms of the outcome of the referendum. I go back again to the Seanokul, a Scá Céile a War Nadini. That was used by President Michael D. Higgins in his speech during his famous state visit to Britain in 2014. Let me just quote from that speech. Ireland and Britain live in both the shadow and in the shelter of one another. And so it has been since the dawn of history. Through conquest and resistance, we have cast shadows on each other, but we've also gained strength from one another as neighbours. End of quotation. I hope that as Britain considers its relationship with Europe and the strengthening of relationships between Ireland and Britain over recent decades will not be affected by whatever the outcome of that deliberation is, and our countries will continue to grow together. I look forward to hearing this afternoon the diverse perspectives which we're going to hear from our various panelists, and to understand better the contribution, not the contribution, but to understand better the consequences of what might happen were Brexit to take place. So with those few words, I welcome our panelists. I look forward to the discussion, and I'm sorry that I have to leave in the next few minutes because I've got to get to London, as I said tonight, for an event in London for our graduates, and I regret that because I would really like to have heard the discussion, but I'm sure it will be an interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll benefit from it, and Gormila Magi. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to introduce you to the British Ambassador to Ireland, Dominic Chilcott, who has served as Ambassador to Ireland since 2012 and who will leave his post later this year. But during his time here in Ireland, and it has indeed been a very busy time for the British Ambassador, a joint programme of bilateral initiatives was launched by the Taoiseach Enda Kenny and British Prime Minister David Cameron. There was, of course, the state visit of President Michael D. Higgins to the UK in 2014, as well as the visit of Britain's Prince Charles and his wife Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, to County Clare, to Galway and to Sligo just last year, which has all helped to cement and to strengthen the relationship between both countries. Ambassador Dominic Chilcott, you're most welcome to NUI Galway. Thank you.
Thank you, Eimear, and good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon, Dr. Jim Brown, and thank you for your hospitality and very warm welcome, and thank you too to all the panellists on behalf of the British Embassy for being co-workers in this afternoon's seminar about Britain and Europe. I think Oscar Wilde said there's one thing worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. There's absolutely no danger at the moment that the UK around the chancelleries of Europe is not being talked about. And I feel really we should apologise for being the squeakiest wheel on the trolley at the moment. But there are reasons for it, and perhaps it's helpful as a starting point to explain a little bit about why we are facing this momentous decision, a decision which David Cameron has said is the most important decision that the UK will take in a generation about its future. And I guess there is an important distinction to be made, perhaps between the UK's view of the role the European Union plays in the development of the country from that view taken by other member states. And what I'm really driving at is that for the original 6 member states, it's quite clear the European Union was the peace project to prevent a further conflict on the continent of Europe provoked by rivalry and tensions between France and Germany. And that for the Mediterranean countries, the southern Mediterranean countries, Portugal, Spain, Greece, who joined later, that the European Union was all about consolidating democracy and the rule of law and preventing a return to the dictatorial past from which those countries had recently emerged. And similarly for the Central Europeans, when they joined, the European Union was a guarantee of their new liberal democracies wouldn't be turned around into the totalitarian systems that they had endured under the Warsaw Pact period, and that Russia's baleful influence in Central Europe would be kept at bay by European Union membership. Now, all these are existential reasons for the countries concerned, but for the UK it's always felt a bit different, that the European Union hasn't really saved our democratic institutions. It doesn't guarantee the rule of law. And because our experience of the Second World War, awful though it was that it wasn't a war fought on our territory, the feeling about it, I think, is less visceral. And indeed, in our national myth and our national sense of ourselves, we often look back at that time as, quote, our finest hour, unquote. So I think in the UK, what that means is there's no overriding existential reason why we need to belong to the European Union in the public imagination. And so the judgment about whether or not the UK should be in comes down to a more prosaic calculation of the pros and cons. To what extent does being in the European Union benefit me as a citizen on the Clapham Omnibus or elsewhere in the UK? And for lots of people, that's a hard question to answer, because most people don't really understand the complexity of how the European Union works, and indeed what the benefits are, either in terms of prosperity or security or influence in the world, or whatever they might be. But what they do know is they know about the things they don't like. And some of those things that they don't like can be quite easily captured in words and phrases that are readily understood and make a connection emotionally with people. So the main three areas where people who are arguing that we should leave the European Union, the main three areas start, I think, with a question of immigration, go on to the amount of money that the UK pays net to the European Union budget, and then thirdly talks about where rules are made that govern our lives. Should they be being made in the European institutions, or should they be made at home? On the question of immigration, which is a difficult subject to address without appearing to be accused of a certain sort of politics that one doesn't want to be associated with, nonetheless, it is an important question, and one shouldn't dismiss, I think, the fears of, or the worries or concerns of ordinary people about immigration. Net immigration into the UK to July last year was in the order of 350,000 people. That's net immigration. And I think it's not unreasonable to ask oneself, is there a level of immigration into a member state or a country the size of the UK, which is not in geographical terms an enormous area, is there a net amount of immigration or a level of immigration beyond which it's unreasonable to expect a society readily to absorb? And at a certain point, it is reasonable that people should ask for there to be controls imposed. Now, of that 350,000 people, about 170,000 were not EU citizens. So arguably, or not just arguably, in practice, we have national control over whether we let those people in. But because the economy is as vibrant in the UK as it is, we needed those 170,000 people to come and work in the UK, or they had family members who were in the UK and were entitled to settle because of those family members. And we haven't kept those people out. And that leaves 180,000 people who then came from the European Union and who were entitled, by virtue of the free movement of people, benefits to travel freely and to reside in the UK and to look for work in the UK. And one of the arguments by those people who want to leave the European Union is if we left the European Union, we would be able to do something about both the 170,000 non-EU citizens net and the 180,000 EU citizens, about which at the moment we have no powers. On the costs, you may have seen Boris Johnson on the telly last night, I think, putting in a cheque for 360 million quid per week into a furnace and burning it with much self-satisfaction. That figure is disputed. I think it's not there's no doubt that we do make a substantial net contribution to the EU budget, but the figure is in the order of £200 million a week, not £360 million a week, which is a gross figure and takes no account of the money we get back from EU programmes and indeed from the budget rebate that the UK enjoys. But it's still a significant figure. And thirdly, there is the issue of control and democracy. How can we throw the rascals out, which is ultimately the question that I think if you want to show that you really have democratic accountability, if you don't like the people that govern you, you can get rid of them. And a sense that it doesn't really matter how you vote in elections, it's very hard to get rid of the people in the institutions that govern you. And I think, again, that's not an unreasonable concern for people to have. So I'm not trying to put the argument for leaving, although it may sound like that. There is a second part to these remarks. But I do want people to understand why it is that there is this concern in the UK, with no existential overriding reason to belong, and a method perhaps of capturing some of the worries about Europe that resonate with people and have genuine salience. And that's why we're there. So the British government position in the face of this was to try and deal with the European question, which was stirring up a degree of unease in our politics, particularly on the centre-right of our politics, by a threefold strategy: reform, referendum and remain. So in February at the European Council this year, David Cameron managed to negotiate a package of reform measures that dealt with some of the concerns that people in the UK have about our EU membership. He then said he would take those reforms, or that reform package, into a referendum on our membership, an in-out referendum, a one-off referendum, not a referendum where if the British public voted the wrong way, they would be asked to vote again a few months later. So he's quite committed to the fact that whatever way the British public vote, he will carry out the expressed will of the people. But the third R, the remain part, he is quite convinced that the UK's best interests in terms of our prosperity and security and influence in the world are served by the UK remaining in a reformed European Union. And that is the position of the government. As you know, a number of cabinet ministers, a minority of cabinet ministers, have resiled from that position, and they are campaigning for the exit or the leave side of the argument. But the majority of opinion in the cabinet and therefore in the government is to remain. And as a British civil servant, my job is to carry out the wishes, support the policies of the constitutionally and duly elected government of the day. So I'm very pleased to be able to stand here and make the case for remain, or at least explain why the government believes that the case for remain suits the UK better than the alternative. I'm going to be very brief because I'm going to speak for a few minutes more. With the date of the referendum, we know that's on the 23rd of June. The government has said if the people vote to leave, they will immediately implement the procedure set out in the treaties for leaving the European Union, the so-called Article 50 process. So we will begin a negotiation to withdraw ourselves from the European Union and establish a new relationship. And there's been a certain amount of work done by the civil service in the UK on what the alternative models look like compared to membership, based on existing relationships between countries outside the European Union and the Union itself. So you may have heard about the Norway model, or the Switzerland model, or the Canada model, or the Turkey model, or the WTO membership model. All these alternatives are interesting. The Treasury analysis, which is supported by most most economic think tanks, and I'm sure we'll hear more of this from the panel in a few moments, argues strongly that in terms of prosperity, none of the alternatives to membership provide the same benefits economically as being a European Union member state. There is another point, which is maybe a little bit more speculative, but I think absolutely germane to the argument, which is that given the objections of those that wish to leave the European Union are based on the movement of people, on immigration, on the net contribution to the budget deficit, and on this sense of where are the laws being made that govern us, it's very hard to imagine that we would accept a sort of Norway-style alternative to membership. Norway is not in the European Union, but is fully in the single market. But the price it pays, if it's a price, for being fully in the single market is it has to accept the free movement of people, unconstrained. It has to make a significant contribution to the EU budget. And of course, the laws of the single market, all the regulations of the single market, are made in Brussels. It has to implement them all in full without actually being in the room helping to make them. So it becomes a law taker, not a law maker. So it seems to me for those reasons, it's very unlikely that a UK that had decided to leave the European Union would settle on a status rather like Norway. If we don't have full access to the single market as it is now, we're going to have something less by definition. And if we're going to have something less, it means, as a minimum, that the trade that we enjoy at the moment with the other member states of the European Union will be to some extent constrained by tariff or non-tariff barriers and rules of origin of products regulations, and all these sorts of minutiae that will have to be captured in a special bilateral agreement between the UK and the then remaining European Union. And that agreement will have to be enforced, which means probably at the border of the European Union, the external border of the European Union, there will have to be some sorts of controls that the goods and services that cross or exit the European Union and go into the UK, or vice versa, are compliant with the treaty arrangements that we will have arrived at. It's already been said that the only country with which the UK has a land border is the Republic, and I therefore leave it as an open question, therefore, as to what that might say about the future status of the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland and the UK more widely. Very briefly, as the British ambassador here, I also worry that one of the great benefits of our both being members of the European Union is that over the years we have moved from being rather wary strangers to one another in terms of our governments, our ministers and our officials, to being really quite close allies and partners within the European Union through a process of discovery of one another in the working groups and the councils of the European Union over 40 years. And we have a very good relationship with Norway in the UK, but we see Norwegian ministers very little, and we see Norwegian officials not very often either. And actually, we don't have many sort of points of friction between the UK and Norway, and it's sort of the relationship takes care of itself without too much attention. But the relationship with Ireland is not like that. It's much more complex, it's much more rich, it's much more multi-layered, and there are more areas where things might go wrong and they need to be put right, and putting them right requires trust and confidence and knowledge of one another. And without the regular contact that we have at the moment in Brussels, I would worry that over time we would drift apart from each other, and that some of the things that we're able to deal with well today could become issues that become irritants in our relations. And I think the growing apart, which may sound a bit psychological, is nonetheless, I think, a real question for us. And the steadying effect of both being members of the European Union on our bilateral relations, it would be a shame if that were to be withdrawn. There's a whole host of issues that apply particularly, I think, to Northern Ireland, but I won't go into those now. Perhaps we'll hear more of those from the panel later. In the opinion polls at the moment, insofar as the opinion polls are a useful indicator of how people will vote in a few weeks' time on the 23rd of June, and I think that is a moot point given the recent history of opinion polls as predictors of general election results. Anyway, the opinion polls are telling us it's a very close race. I think the very latest poll that I saw this morning, published in the Times by YouGov, had the Remain camp 4 percentage points ahead of the Leave camp. But what we don't know is to what extent people who want to vote Leave will turn out and actually vote, or the people who want to vote to Remain will bother to turn out and vote. And you may tell, by the way, I even put the question that the research that has been done suggests that people who want to vote to Leave, who've been waiting for years and years for the opportunity to have this referendum to express their view, are probably going to vote, as a high proportion of them will go and vote, than those that Remain, many of whom may on the day not bother or not manage to do it, and may be less motivated to go and vote. So even if the opinion polls suggest things are close, the turnout for both camps will be extremely important. Ireland has a lot of skin in this game, as the President has already said, as others I'm sure will say too, and we welcome the involvement of Irish organisations, Irish bodies, the Irish government in making it clear where they believe Irish national interests lie, so that those people who live in the UK, who are sensitive and aware of the importance of the Irish dimension in their lives and in this debate can hear clearly the position of Irish bodies and the Irish government. There are some 500,000 or so Irish nationals that live in the UK. They all have, if they're permanently resident in the UK, they have the right to vote in this referendum if they're adults. There are maybe as many as 5 million people in the UK who have or had an Irish grandparent, which again is a very large number of people with Irish family and some Irish blood in their system. And for them also, the effect of Britain leaving the European Union on relations with Ireland and in Ireland itself may also be a factor. And I think it's important for wider reasons, but particularly for this large group of people, that they should both express their opinion and be conscious of how this issue is seen on this side of the Irish Sea. So for all those reasons, I'm delighted to be here. It's great to have this opportunity to say a few words on this very important subject, the most important subject that the UK will decide upon in the rest of my lifetime, I expect. And I look forward very much to hearing what the panel has to say. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now we're going to hear from our illustrious panel who will give their own individual perspectives on Brexit for a period of approximately 5 minutes each. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on time because I know we have a lot of questions probably to answer later on. So after that, we'll open up the debate amongst the panellists themselves, and then, of course, also open up the debate to yourselves, the audience. So without further ado, John McHale, our first speaker. He's the established professor and director of the Whitaker Institute for Innovation and Societal Change at NUI Galway. He has served as chairman of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council since July 2011. Before joining NUI Galway, he held positions at Harvard University, at the Queen's University, Ontario. Professor McHale has been a consultant to the World Bank on various migration and development projects, and he is currently president of the Irish Economics Association. John.
Thank you very much, Eimear. I think the plan is that we will stay in our seats. You're very welcome, Ambassador Chilcott. I'm going to begin by talking about the boring economics and then pass on to the much more exciting politics with Mairéad. On the Fiscal Council, as we scan for risks facing the Irish economy and also our trading partners, the possibility of Brexit certainly looms very large, and all the more so with the closeness of the opinion polls. Now, we don't know precisely what the contours of any post-Brexit arrangements would be, but even in the best case scenario, it would involve a very large shock to trade, to investment, and to income. From the viewpoint of the UK, doing a cost-benefit analysis, it's very hard to see a Brexit passing any cost-benefit test. And even though us economists are sort of not knowing for our tendency to agree with one another, there really is almost unanimity amongst economists, and particularly amongst academic economists, that a Brexit would be bad economically for the UK. So why are we so pessimistic? Studies show that the EU has increased trade between the UK and the EU by about 75%, so very large trade effect. Estimates also indicate on sort of a central scenario that UK trade overall would fall by 20%. This assumes that Brexit would involve in adopting something like the Swiss model that the ambassador talked about. There would likely be similar falls in foreign direct investment. From other studies, we know that both trade and foreign direct investment have a substantial positive effect on productivity. So for every 1% decrease in trade, credible estimates show about a 0.6% fall in productivity. The effects of FDI are somewhat less, but still quite significant. So the implications for overall income and household income in the UK are really, I think, quite stark. Again, the ambassador mentioned the Treasury's analysis, and there's been a lot of very similar analysis done by bodies such as the OECD, the London School of Economics, and so on, and they all come to roughly similar conclusions. So again, on a central forecast, the projection is that by roughly 2030, GDP would be 6.2% lower in the UK following Brexit, and household income would be about £4,300 lower, measured in today's prices. So these are very large effects. As a result of the inevitable uncertainty, there's also substantial short-term effects, which are lowering growth and having some offsetting effect in terms of depreciation of sterling. But it's very interesting that the Bank of England recently came out and first of all predicted that if the UK actually did vote to leave, that the uncertainty would increase and the exchange rate might depreciate quite sharply, and that creates a really difficult situation for them. On the one hand, this would slow growth, on the other hand, it would likely lead to higher inflation. And then they would be faced with a real dilemma where they could end up having to raise interest rates in the teeth of a recession or a near recession to fight the inflation that would come partly as a result of the exchange rate depreciation. So we could be in for quite a rocky ride in the near term as well. So economists think of these things in terms of a cost-benefit calculation. So what are the benefits? And the ambassador, I think, listed the three main benefits that are sometimes put out there of a Brexit. Less regulation coming from Brussels, avoiding having to make this net budgetary contribution to the European Union, and the most visceral concerns, I think, coming about through related to migration. But the question is, do these negative effects really stand up to scrutiny? And I think the case is much weaker than I think a lot of voters probably think. On regulation, if the UK adopted a Norway-style model or a Swiss-style model, they would largely still have to have many of the regulations in order to access EU markets. Moreover, currently, UK product and labour markets are amongst the most liberalised in the OECD. So there isn't evidence that regulations coming from the European Union are leading to highly unregulated markets. Maybe David will tell us later that he thinks that they should be maybe more regulated than they are. But the fact is, despite this, despite membership of the European Union, the UK has a highly liberal economy. And I think even much of those regulations, even contentious regulations like the Working Time Directive, I think there's a very high likelihood that that would stay in place. It provides things that people really value, and I think it would be very hard to take that away. On the net budgetary contribution, again, as the ambassador said, in order to retain access to the single market post-Brexit, these contributions will still need to be made. It's sort of estimated that if you were to adopt the Norway model, for instance, you would still have to make roughly 90% of the current level of contribution. But actually, much more importantly than that, given the size of the income shock the UK would likely face with Brexit, that would have huge fiscal implications that would be many times more in terms of fiscal loss than any savings that would come about through reduced contributions. And then most controversially of all is the immigration issue, particularly immigration from Central and Eastern Europe, and as the ambassador said, the numbers are very high. But here, the best evidence we have from economics tells us that on balance, sort of looking across all skill categories, there's a small positive effect on UK wages and employment from this migration. Now, there is some evidence at the least skilled parts of the UK labour market that there might be some small negative effects. But in terms of the net fiscal contribution of immigrants, there's overwhelming evidence because of their age and education profile that over the time spent in the UK, that they make significant positive net fiscal contributions, notwithstanding a lot of what we hear about benefit tourism. So on the whole, I think the arguments for the benefits of Brexit are very weak relative to the costs. Just a few words about the effect of Brexit on Ireland, and here, unfortunately, the research base is somewhat more narrow, and therefore the effects more uncertain. But we know from the ESRI's macro model that every 1% decrease in UK GDP leads to a roughly 0.3% decrease in Irish GDP. So if the UK is doing badly, that will have strong knock-on effects to the Irish economy. The ESRI also estimates that trade with the UK is likely to fall by 20% or more, which would have additional negative effects on Irish productivity. While a small amount of FDI might be diverted to Ireland as a result of the UK leaving, but against that, and really overwhelming that, is the fact that lower FDI into the UK, which I think would almost certainly result with lower UK income, and that would have very strong negative effects on Ireland. Whatever sort of bilateral agreement might be reached on immigration between the UK and Ireland, it's very hard to see how passport checks could be avoided on the border with Northern Ireland. So in terms of maintaining the common travel area, I think there would be very big effects. And the combination of uncertainty and, from Ireland's point of view, exchange rate appreciation of the euro, even in the short run, there would be negative effects. So we have an awful lot more research to do. I see my colleague Stephen Hines, who's working hard on the impacts of Brexit on Ireland's ocean economy. Other people are working on different sectors, such as agriculture. So there's a lot more work we need to do, but based on what we know at the moment, the effects on the Irish economy would be quite substantial. How am I doing for time?
You're a little bit over.
A little over, so I will stop at that.
Yeah, we'll get to lots more. Thank you
Great,
very much,
thanks.
Professor McHale. I'm going to introduce you now to Mairéad McGuinness. She is, of course, the Fine Gael MEP for Midlands North West, and she's also Vice President of the European Parliament. She also serves on the European Parliament's Agriculture and Rural Development Committee and the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. As Vice President, she chairs sessions of Parliament and oversees the Parliament's communications. Fáilte Ruth Mairéad.
But while I'm chassus, because unusually I had lunch today, and if I sit, I perhaps might not perform to one's best. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the University for inviting me here to be part of this distinguished panel. As a former journalist, can I ask you a question? How many have a vote in this referendum? How many here gathered? 1, 2, 3. How many have an opinion about this referendum, whether it will be good for Ireland if there's a Brexit? Good for Ireland, okay. Or bad? Okay, I do that really because it's useful to know to whom we speak, and also we're speaking to a wider audience as well. Very gloomy predictions in terms of the economy from an Irish perspective and a UK perspective. I want to talk to you about the politics of all of this and maybe give you some sense of where the Parliament and indeed the Brussels system looks at the decision, which will be taken by UK citizens. And I think that of all of the member states of the 28, I think there's an understanding and almost an expectation that Irish politicians will be engaged in this debate. And I use that word engaged rather than involved. And I think we have to be engaged because of the fact of the island of Ireland and our very close relationship with the UK, which was so well explained by the Ambassador. And I know there are many other colleagues in the Parliament, and I sit with the EPP group, who would love to actually be engaged. And out of respect for the fact that this is a UK referendum, a decision that has to be taken by UK citizens, many members of Parliament are holding back really and saying, look, we are watching this debate. We of course have concerns, but we don't want to interfere. I think from our perspective here in Ireland and Irish politicians, we do want to be engaged in this debate because, I mean, I'm from County Louth. I grew up against the background of a very troubled times on the border. I recall, checks on the border, my mother's handbag being looked into. I mean, things that are unbelievable today to younger people. And therefore, the idea of what might happen if there is a Brexit looms large in our minds. I wish the title of today's debate was Debating Remain. But it's interesting that Brexit is the bigger new word in our dictionary than Remain. But remember that Remain is the outcome that we would like to see. I want to pick up one word which you said, Professor, which was shock. And I think when you look at what a profound moment it is that UK citizens will again vote to either stay or leave the European Union, I think if there's a decision to leave, there will be a very big political shock to the European Union. Of that there is no doubt. Because it would be the first time that a major country would have made a democratic decision to leave. And I think it will be watched by everybody, but let's not pretend that there are other member states at the moment. Within their populations, there are people who are anxious about Europe and uncertain about the European Union. And therefore, a decision taken by the UK citizens will have an impact in the general discussion for the rest of the member states. I mean, the words shadow and shelter were used by the President, and I would like to think that there's no member state that's in the shadow, but I do sometimes think that our UK, because perhaps of the relationship so described by the Ambassador, have a sense of slight disconnect. I think when Ireland joined the European Union, for us, in a sense, it was about more of our freedom. We were freer as part of a bigger union than perhaps we felt outside of it. So we have a very different relationship where we can be critical of Europe, but we know we're very much engaged in the European Union. This morning when I was driving down from Northmead, I took a detour to a small school in Galway that had invited me to visit them. And it was lovely to hear the young people, 5th and 6th class, talk about the history of Europe, about the reasons for its very being, because to some extent that story is not being told, and perhaps people are not interested as much in it because we've moved to another space. But I think it's no harm that we remember that, and the children told that story very well. And I also asked them about the idea of compromise and solidarity, and I think children get it better than perhaps adults do in today's world. On the issue of uncertainty, and I mentioned that around this idea of a shock, I think there is huge uncertainty across all of the member states, driven by the economic difficulties and by migration and the refugee crisis. And there is a sense in some member states that we might be, the sense of circling the wagon around ourselves, look after ourselves. And that's something that I think would not be in Ireland's interests, or indeed the interests of the wider European Union. I believe that solving problems collectively is better than countries trying to do it on their own. But one of the key points for me around the situation after, so on the 24th, if there was a decision by the UK citizens to leave, things will not be the same. And I think sometimes in the debate that I'm hearing, there is a sense that people are suggesting on the leave side that, look, nothing much will change. We're a big country. The European Union will still want to do business with us. So in a sense, we will leave, but nothing will change. Now, I think that would be wrong if people believe that that is the case, because you either are a member of the European Union or you're not. There will be this period of disconnecting should it happen. The minimum will be 2 years, but it could be longer. And the process could be difficult and painful. I'm even not clear as to what the situation of members of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom would be in that period. But there would be a very different relationship between the European Union and the 27 other member states. And I think it's fair to say that it would be unlikely that the arrangements for a member state that might leave the European Union would be soft and gentle afterwards, so that I would have thought that the remaining countries would say, if we believe that the EU is strong and important and we want countries to stay in, then should a country choose to leave, then we just have to be quite firm about what are the consequences of that. Now, clearly from an Irish point of view, we might have other concerns and want to do different things, but I do absolutely have to say that you either are a member of the European Union, which I hope the United Kingdom will be after June the 23rd, or you're not. And the huge uncertainty created by that have not all been worked through or looked at in any particular detail. So I think that disengagement process is quite significant. A few comments on democracy. I know it's a boring reality, but laws are made by politicians that are elected. They're national politicians and members of the European Parliament that are made up of directly elected politicians. And I suppose that complicated structure has not been well explained. They may be proposed by the Commission, but it is elected members of national governments and of the European Parliament that actually make decisions. And one piece of legislation I'm working on, which will impact here in Galway, is medical devices. And I have to say that the UK Minister and the officials have engaged with me really well on this issue. So it is not that there's a disconnect, that some anonymous person makes a law and imposes. We're all involved in this process. And Europe gets a bad press, perhaps because politicians don't come back and say what's actually been agreed and that they were part of that decision. So the issue of democracy, I think, needs to be discussed more deeply. On regulation, I mean, I deal a lot with the environment side and agriculture, and everyone talks about bureaucracy. I have to say that I cannot envisage a situation where, should the United Kingdom leave the European Union, that many of the regulations around the food industry will change at all. I cannot see that happening. So again, to argue that if we leave, we can dismantle all of this red tape and bureaucracy and life will be easier, I don't envisage that, because a lot of the regulations, which may be cumbersome, were required because we had flaws in our system that needed to be fixed with regulation. We can always do it better, and we can certainly do with less of it, but that's something you fix from within, not by retreating to the outside. So I think those are our core issues. The one issue which perhaps wasn't mentioned was this notion of ever closer union, which is really ever closer union between peoples. And I have to say, when I talked to the school children this morning, the idea of ever closer union between peoples, in my view, is quite a good thing. Why not let everybody get on well together in our own space and talk and deal with each other? So I don't regard that as a big issue. My last comment is around the single market, and I think that's been alluded to already by one of our panelists here. I mean, the European Union gives Ireland access to a marketplace we would never have were we not members of it. And the freedom to move goods and services, and indeed people, are part of the fundamentals of the European Union. The difficulty with that when it is already in place is that we perhaps don't understand the importance of it. And I think it therefore requires us to talk in great detail, as has already been done, about what are the consequences where somebody decides not to be part of that union and therefore is denied access to the single market, or at least has to renegotiate entry into it. My sense at this stage of the process, and we've still some time to run, and I'm sure politicians are tired in the United Kingdom, and maybe the public are too, I've been very heartened by the debates that I've heard on radio and television in the United Kingdom. I think that it will help generally to perhaps change the narrative around the European Union, because there has to be a balance. So I've been very impressed when I've seen some panels where they're spoken to by both pro and anti-European Union figures, and they're coming to different conclusions than they had themselves expected. So the debate, I think, is really healthy. The turnout will be critical. There are people who, for example, in the European Parliament, who are vehemently opposed to the European Union, and I respect their right to have that view, but we will never convince them at all to change their view. There are people who are very undecided, and I think want a little bit of certainty or debate around encouraging them to vote to stay. And there are others, perhaps more the younger generation, who will vote to stay, but whether they turn out in great numbers or not, and we'll hear more about the Irish engagement in that, is open to question. We're having this debate perhaps because of the wider question of European uncertainty, but principally because there's always been this debate of unfinished business in the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party have been split on this. They withdrew from our political group in the Parliament, the European People's Party, over this particular issue. Even if there's a vote to stay, which I clearly hope there will be, I think there will still be ongoing questions about the United Kingdom and the European Union. And I don't regard that as an unhealthy situation. I think in today's world, things being certain in politics, that day is over. There are no certainties. What is only certain from the 23rd of June is a decision will be taken. And the British Prime Minister, to be taken at his word, said he will immediately implement that decision. My hope is that his implementation will mean no change, or better still, change from within. My fear is that the public will opt to leave. And then we are looking into a very big black hole where there are many twists and turns, and there are absolutely no certainties other than the European Union will be reduced to 27 member states, and there will be a big political shock to the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mairéad McGuinness. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, David Begg. He is Director of TASC, Think Tank for Action on Social Change. He's also Chairman of the Pensions Authority. He was formerly General Secretary of ICTU and spent 5 years as CEO of Concern Worldwide in the late 1990s. His book, Comparing Ireland with Other Small Open Economies in Europe, was published recently and is titled Ireland, Small Open Economies and European Integration Lost in Translation. David Begg, Falteruth.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, what I propose to do is say a few words about this question in the context of the European integration project itself, talk a little bit then about how I think it will affect Ireland, and lastly, just one or two words about the United Kingdom itself. I think the timing is rather unfortunate, frankly, from the point of view of the European Union, because apart from this particular question, Europe is facing existential crises on about 5 fronts, I think, at the moment. Question of migration, of course, and questions of security, questions of anemic economic growth, even though those conditions are improving ever so slightly. Difficulties internally between the German view of Europe and actually the view of Mario Draghi in the European Central Bank about the stimulus to the European economy. And the knock-on question about the fact that somehow or other the original project to achieve a European Germany has actually given us a German Europe, which has great historical kind of connotations, as we all know. And then I would say perhaps the biggest problem of all is this, that European integration for the first 60 years or so has proceeded on the basis of a kind of permissive consensus in Europe. That's to say, it's not doing any harm. It's generally a good thing, so we're all in favour of it. But that's not the case anymore, unfortunately. And you can see right across Europe the development of a strong Euroscepticism and, in many cases, quite strong right-wing political parties, to a lesser extent some left-wing political parties opposed to it. But the political landscape in quite a few countries of Europe has changed very significantly in the last few years. Now, the departure of Britain, of course, is an enormous hit for Europe, because Britain is the second largest economy in Europe. And that is bound to have an effect on the whole confidence, I think, of the European project itself. It's of enormous importance to us too, because we are Britain's 5th largest trading partner. But we're in a different situation, I suggest, and it's a point well captured actually by Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister. He's just published a book there recently, and he has an interesting title on the book. He said, "The weak suffer what they must." Now, that's part of a quotation from Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars. I can't even say it properly, but it's the original touchstone, if you like, for realist politics. But the full quotation is from the dialogue in the book was, "The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must." Now, in this relationship, Britain can do things like that without catastrophic consequences. There will be consequences, but Britain can still do it. But we, on the other hand, are potentially in a very difficult situation, I think, as a result. And it will be a huge shock to ourselves. And it's a strange thing in a way that this is a question not hugely debated, I think, within the body politic here, and which is one of the reasons why it's so good to have a forum like this to chat about these things. Because Ireland, I think, is in a somewhat unique position in Europe. We are an outlier, really, not just geographically, but we occupy a place, if you think of it, within a kind of a currency triangle between the euro, sterling, and the dollar. we have such a reliance on foreign direct investment from the United States, and of course Britain is such an important market for our indigenous industry. And generally speaking, our economy cycles out of phase with the European economy. So decisions made at a European level don't often suit us all that well. The other thing to say is that a big vision of Europe has not featured very much here in public debate. It's very hard to remember any really senior politician making a very big speech on Europe. And in fact, the main interest in Europe has really been twofold, and Mairéad referred to it, one of the questions there. Probably the biggest question, frankly, is what we could get out of it, and our common agricultural policy and our concerns for that have featured extremely strongly. And the other was, what does it mean in terms of Irish independence? And Europe has been sort of an extension of the independence project for us. It's really been the means by which we could assert ourselves internationally. But the great paradox is that we depend on Britain being alongside us at all critical stages. You know, we couldn't go into the European Economic Community in the first case without Britain. And of course, even when we went into EMU, our decision was predicated on Britain ultimately going in. And there was good reason to think that they would at the time, because it was well known that Tony Blair was in favour of it, although Gordon Brown wasn't, and ultimately they didn't. But our decision was predicated on that particular possibility, at least, if not initially, coming along later. I'm going to suggest to you that our relationship with Europe has been characterised by something of an intellectual failure. And whether we agree or not with what British people do, the fact of the matter is that Britain has considered these questions in very great detail in a way that we never had. Our treatment of the European question has been quite superficial. But I think that we're in for a bit of a shock, quite frankly, because if Britain does actually leave, it will have very significant consequences for how we proceed in the future. Now, my own view, frankly, is that, and it's only a guess, nobody can know, and I think what Mairéad said is quite true, it will depend on the turnout. I think that possibly David Cameron will shade it. But it depends on the vote being over 60%. I mean, the common consensus is that the vote is under 60%, it's gone. Britain's out, because the older people will vote and they will vote out. If you have a high turnover, the younger people may perhaps vote to stay in. Contrary really to every other country in Europe, it's the direct opposite really to what one finds. But here's the problem. What David Cameron himself yesterday called the danger of an referendum. The fact that it won't settle the question, that if the margin of the vote is quite tight, that the question will arise again and again. And even Nigel Farage has been saying, well, you know, if it's sort of something like 60-40, that'll be okay. But if it's 52-48, it's not okay. We'll be back to this again. And my fear is that as we move forward, the basic Euroscepticism, which seems to have taken a great hold of the British imagination at the moment, and on the other hand, the ultimate necessity for deepening integration in Europe in order to consolidate the position of the single currency, that this will be a kind of a centrifugal force, pulling Europe, pulling Britain apart from Europe in the future. And I think the best case for us is that if Britain votes to stay in on this occasion, we need to take it as a warning and prepare for a different future, because sooner or later, in my opinion, Britain will actually leave. And what does that mean for us if that happens? I mean, John has talked eloquently about the economic consequences, and I think they're quite right. I think actually we have a bit of a dilemma here from an industrial policy point of view, because the Single European Act was extremely important to us in getting access to European markets and attracting in foreign direct investment. And that's the interest of the foreign sector. But the interest of the domestic sector, the indigenous industries, is very much in Britain. There is that conflict in that as well, which we will have to prepare for the future. But another point, and I think John was sort of half inviting me to comment on this, it'll be an interesting situation. I mean, we are unusual in Europe in that we are, like Britain, a liberal market economy. Although the literature would say we're a liberal market economy with certain counter tendencies. I won't go into those because it would take too long. But consider how we will find ourselves in a Eurozone of social market economies with, for example, much higher levels of taxation and public spending than we have been used to here in Ireland under our liberal framework. So I think that it's a bit unlikely that it would be tolerated that we would have an exceptional position in that grouping in the future. So that would mean a fundamental change, I think, in the way that we look at things. And personally, that aspect of it, I don't think would be too bad for us. I think we would have a more sustainable economy in the long run. That's not to say I'm in favour of Britain leaving. I'm not. I think the consequences are too harsh and too severe and much too risky. But I think it's worth considering and looking at for the long-term future. The last thing I want to say absolutely is that I think it's a bit unfortunate that, and I've said this to the ambassador before, that the social democratic perspective in Europe has not been hugely ventilated in the debate in Britain, I think, so far. And one of the reasons is that really the fact, I suppose, that the leadership of the Labour Party at the moment is not social democratic, essentially. People feel, I think, that neither John McDonnell nor Jeremy Corbyn, although they have both made the case for staying in, do not do so from a social democratic perspective, in the sense that they don't actually really believe in Europe. They believe it's a vast capitalist plot, and they are not actually happy with that. But this is a great pity, I think, because there are important things, important values inherent in Europe, which the British people, I would hope, would consider in the referendum, rather than simply economic questions, important as they are. But there is this big vision thing, this big set of values that are not being addressed at all. And it's rather sad, I thought last night, I heard Nigel Farage speak on television. I know that, you know, he might not be the most representative person or anything like that, but he started talking about immigration in terms of, you know, violence on the streets. It's over 50 years since Enoch Powell made his speech about the Tiber foaming with blood and the question of immigration then. And Britain survived for 50 years without falling under that particular question of immigration. But I think that at the same time there is a need to examine some of those questions, because you remember back in 2010, Gordon Brown had this debate with a lady called Mrs. Duffy. And he was heard to get into his car. Mrs. Duffy was saying, look, I've been a supporter of the Labour Party all my life, but there are really serious issues about immigration which need to be dealt with. And Gordon Brown got into his car and said, that is a bigoted woman. You know, now he was overheard and he had to apologise for it. But I think the difficulty of the centre left probably has not assimilated the real fears of people sufficiently well and dealt with them sufficiently. But I think it's a voice which is really absent in the British debate, and I think that's actually quite unfortunate. Thank you.
David Begg, thank you. Now, time is catching on. I've been a little bit remiss in my moderating duties. I'm going to ask Noelle O'Connell to keep to 5 minutes. Noelle O'Connell is up next. She was appointed Executive Director of the European Movement Ireland in April 2011. Prior to leading European Movement Ireland, Noelle provided business development training, education and public affairs consultancy to a wide variety of both private and public sector clients. Fáilte Ruth, Noelle.
Sucht Curga Turtum, Chakgadi, Old School Naher and Galvanuf, Ta'anos, Venchunuf. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and I will certainly take on board the 5-minute warning. Many thanks to NUIG and the British Embassy for inviting myself and European Movement Ireland to be here today. We're delighted to be involved on this really, really crucial and important topic as part of our National Conversation series of events on the UK's... Sorry, is that me?
No, just the microphone maybe.
Okay. On the UK's EU reform and referendum agenda. Indeed, I think the last time the Ambassador and I spoke on this panel, he very kindly was down in UCC speaking on this topic not so long ago. So we're doing a good tour of the third level establishments throughout the country, which I think is certainly important. Drawing the short straw, I suppose, as Conall and I have in coming near the end of proceedings means, unfortunately, in some ways, that all the interesting facts and statistics have been claimed by our esteemed co-speakers. So it falls to me to try and come up with something new. So I will do my very best to rise to the challenge. So as we have seen today and throughout indeed the public debate on this issue in the UK, in Ireland and around Europe, the views about what would happen if a Brexit were to occur and if the UK did vote to leave the EU on the 23rd of June are multifaceted. However, the underlying theme of uncertainty and shock, as John mentioned, is a theme that unites all of these arguments. This is something that European Movement Ireland has been working on very actively, and as I tried to talk on this issue, I was kept forgetting how many days or how many weeks to the debate. So I downloaded this app on my phone, and it's telling me this morning that there are 36 days to the 23rd of June. So it's 36 days to when the UK electorate will be faced with a very simple question. It's a very, very simple question, but a very profound one. Should the UK remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? In other words, everything hangs in the balance of those 15 words. And in the immortal words, if I may paraphrase Monty Python somewhat, what has the EU ever done for us? Or for perhaps what has the UK ever done for the EU? And I would argue that quite a lot to both. As the Ambassador has already very eloquently outlined, the relationship between Ireland and the UK has never been better. Our closeness is reflected even in the discourse surrounding the referendum and the possible consequences of a Brexit were to occur, not least our deep and understandable concern over the challenges around the border control and the common travel area. And when we both joined the European Economic Community in 1973, our continued alliance in the policy-making rooms of Brussels have helped foster, grow and nourish this relationship and bring it from strength to strength. In Ireland, as we well know, we are no stranger to referenda. We have checked boxes on many an EU-related ballot paper throughout the years of our membership, 9 times, and sometimes we've even had 2 goes at them. But when we consider the UK's EU upcoming referendum on its EU membership, I think it's important as an Irish audience that we bear in mind 2 points. Number 1, June's referendum in 36 days' time is the UK's second ever EU-related referendum in the 43 years that both Ireland and the UK have been members of the Union. And secondly, the UK is not alone in its desire for a reformed and a reforming EU, and that is something I think that we need to stress. So given Ireland's long and extensive, and some might say now jaded experience with EU referenda, I'd maybe just like to outline some remarks based on our experience to date. And I think it's something Mairéad touched upon. The current political climate that we have now is in stark contrast to that of 1973 when we first joined. We all face formidable cross-border challenges such as migration, climate change and terrorism, as David referenced. Meanwhile, and it's something that is quite worrying really, but citizens tend to have less trust in our elected representatives. And we have seen all too clearly ourselves, it's not always political campaigns that win a referendum. A well-known Irish politician famously said, "A referendum is an opportunity for an electorate to give an answer to a question that wasn't asked." So there is a tendency for topics to hijack many of the real issues, but what we think in terms of framing the debate and looking at the scale. When I'm talking to just some of our colleagues in the UK, one of them asked me, "Noelle, what's the population of Ireland?" And, I kind of paused and said, 4.5 million. And he looked out the window and he said, "Well, we're here in London with a population of 8.65 million. So when we look at the Irish experience, we have to set it in context again in terms of the UK. This is only their second ever EU referendum, and the scale is quite significant. If I can just look at some of the organisations that are campaigning actively on this issue. Irish for Europe is a civil society group working very closely with our sister organisation, European Movement UK, who are trying to promote information on the effects of a Brexit that it would have on Ireland and the Irish people in the UK. And it's encouraging that 500,000 eligible Irish voters to use their voice. set against the backdrop of a larger diaspora, as the ambassador outlined, of those 5 million British people who can claim at least one Irish-born grandparent. So that's not an insignificant cohort when the UK electorate will be going to the polls next month. From an organisational perspective, European Movement Ireland is not advocating how people should vote. However, we are trying to provide a platform for debate, and we are working very hard to ensure that eligible Irish voters, including that Irish cohort, and British people living here in Ireland are aware of their right to vote and their eligibility to do so. And in that regard, we are encouraging them to register in time and to exercise their vote on the day. Our recently launched Phone a Friend campaign is targeting that Irish diaspora and also the 120,000 so British people living here in the Republic who may possibly be eligible to vote. As I mentioned on Galway Bay FM last week, there are, as per the 2011 census, there are 15,080 British people living here in the county of Galway. So again, you know, it's certainly an important voice, and that we do hope that they have their say. We have a unique voice, we have a particular perspective, and we have legitimate stake in this referendum. We commissioned Red C to carry out a poll on EU sentiment last year, and we're going to be doing the same again over the coming weeks and releasing the findings in advance of the 23rd of June. But what we found was when we asked 1,008 people independently throughout the country, should Ireland remain part of the EU if the UK votes to leave? 77% of those said yes. So whatever happens on the 23rd of June, and obviously I personally hope that the vote will be, as Mairéad said, a Remain, Ireland is going to be strongly committed and will still remain a member of the EU, and that sentiment is certainly coming through. The UK is not alone in desiring a reformed EU. It is far from perfect, and this has become starkly clear in recent years, along with the challenges as I outlined. These are formidable, but they are not unique to the EU itself. Rather, they are global, they are cross-border, requiring in turn global and cross-border resolutions. As President Obama very eloquently and very recently put it, the nations who wield their influence most effectively are those that do it through the collective action that today's challenges demand. The EU does not diminish the UK's influence, it magnifies it. I think the golden rule of any negotiation is never walk away from the table. And to that end, a decision to leave the EU would arguably lessen British influence on the world stage at a time when it is needed more than ever. Mairéad spoke about the jargon and the discourse around the debate. What we don't want to see is a Brexit happening. Turnout is going to be key on the day. I was at the ambassador's launch of the voter registration drive, and he mentioned an interesting statistic. There's 5.5 million British people living overseas. In last year's British general election, about 100,000 of those exercised their right to vote. That's only 2%. So this is a really, really large cohort. In addition to the 288,000 so British people who have said who are on the census as living here in Ireland, there's 800,000 British people living in Spain, and followed very closely by France. So the overseas expatriate element is certainly a voice that will have a role to play. Ireland and the UK are strong allies. We are close friends at the European table. And ultimately, from a European Movement Ireland perspective, we strongly believe that an EU without the UK as a member would be bad for Ireland, would be bad for Europe, and would be bad for the UK itself. Thank you.
Now, Conall MacCoille, our last speaker, is Chief Economist with Davy Research since 2010. Previous to that, he worked for 8 years as a monetary policy advisor and senior economist at the Bank of England. He's also worked at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin and as lecturer in DIT. Conall provides expert commentary on the Irish economy, the UK economy and the global economy. What's with Conall?
Goodness. Well, look, it's been a long time so far, so I'll try to be reasonably brief. Just say a few words about the UK and the Irish economy, and I suppose in the spirit of economists never agreeing with each other, I'll disagree with some things John said in terms of the impact on Ireland. So I suppose in terms of the UK, the first thing to say is Brexit is already affecting the UK. We've seen in the first quarter of the year employment effectively flatten off. There's a very nice survey by Deloitte where they ask CFOs in the UK, are you planning to invest? And a year ago, maybe 80% of CFOs in the UK would have said they're going to increase their investment over the next 12 months. Now, minus 20% on balance, think they're going to cut investment. So effectively, companies are putting investment plans on hold. With employment slowing, the key driver of the UK economy, consumer spending, it also appears to be at risk with some very poor retail sales numbers. You saw BHS going to liquidation or going towards liquidation just this week. So we're already seeing the impact of the uncertainty. And it also, you can imagine that if there is a vote to stay in, you see a rebound in confidence in the UK will be fine. But having said all that, this is a particularly bad time for the UK economy to be creating this shock. As it's done very well and moved towards full employment, that progress has been associated with imbalances. The UK still runs a very substantial trade deficit. There's a very large government deficit worth 4% of GDP, which still has to correct. Household saving has never been lower. The household debt as a percentage of income is still the 5th highest in Europe. As well as that, if you look at the UK housing market, well, relative to incomes, UK house prices are 5.7 times. That's back to where it was at the last peak in 2007. And that's not to say that we're going to see a recession necessarily. It's certainly a soft patch around the referendum. But as economies tend to move towards full employment, accidents tend to happen, as we saw ourselves here back in 2007 in vivid detail. So this is a bad time with a very unbalanced recovery, a lot of credit growth for the UK to be creating a shock to confidence. In terms of the long-term effects, you might argue that if you really believe the EU is a very bad thing, it's worth steering close to a recession. But again, I agree with John that if the one thing economists agree on is that the EU single market has really led to growth in trade. That trade growth has been associated with very strong productivity growth and increases in living standards across Europe. So to stop the UK participating in the further progress over the next 10 years in terms of completing the single market, that's obviously a bad thing, and that would hurt UK incomes. And again, the estimates are kind of 1 to 3% in a kind of an optimistic scenario where the UK stays in the single market. They tend to double or triple to 6 to 9 if the UK is outside that single market. So bad news all around, and something that should be avoided. In terms of what happens to Ireland, I think very important to remember on June 24th, whatever the outcome, there will be no change in trading arrangements. There's this 2-year exit period, and indeed I think the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has already argued, or maybe it's in the Treasury document, that given it took 7 years for Canada to negotiate a new trade agreement, that really the 2-year period is exceptionally ambitious, and that you might want to look for an extension so that the UK leaves the EU over a much more extended time period, so that we see no change in tariffs, in labour market access, in terms of the regulations of moving products across countries. So it's going to be quite some time before UK or Irish companies need to think about tariffs or changes in standards. Probably the most pertinent thing that will happen to Ireland is potentially a sharp depreciation of sterling. But this has happened before. Back in 2006, sterling would have been 67p against the euro. It moved towards parity almost by 2008 after Northern Rock and then the financial crisis. But Irish exporters actually weathered that storm pretty well. We tend to price in sterling. In any case, we absorb these exchange rates into our profit margins. And while another point to make is that back in the 1970s, the UK would have accounted for 50% of Irish exports in aggregate. Now it's down to around 17% as we've kind of moved away from an agricultural export base towards a more industrial one. So again, the export exposure is much smaller than in the past. But I think that exchange rate risk can be managed. I suppose just to kind of maybe disagree a little bit with John and some of the other comments is that if we do get a vote for Brexit on June 24th, a lot of the people are saying this could be catastrophic or lead to doomsday type scenarios. We're going to have to do a very quick U-turn and say that Ireland can manage Brexit. And I think while you think about Michael Gove saying the UK will leave the single market, you hear European politicians saying that we're going to have to punish Britain. Really, I think the reality is going to set in that if there is a vote to leave, the UK will be leaving. And then the onus will be on everyone to manage that process as efficiently as possible. And I think after the cooling off period, certainly the onus will be on to maybe extend the exit period and keep the UK essentially in the single market. And I think when you think about these different options, Norway, the WTO, Switzerland, I think Switzerland is an interesting case because they had a referendum on migration. The EU has kind of been in negotiations about if that's going to be allowed. And it's kind of hard for the EU to kind of go against a democratic vote in Switzerland. And I think the end game for me would be, and people may disagree, that some kind of fudge will be required in migration to essentially allow the UK retain single market access. One study that has been done by the ESRI is that 20% of Irish trade could be lost if the UK leaves the EU. I think that is definitely a worst case scenario. And if you actually read the study, what it actually does is use what we call gravity models to model the increase in trade between countries. And that suggests that since the single market in 1992, single market access can explain that extra 20%. But that doesn't mean if the UK leaves, we lose that 20% overnight. And in fact, if you look at countries like the USSR, when that broke up, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, those trade linkages tend to persist for some time afterwards. So we're not going to wake up in 2 years' time and find, my goodness, 20% of our trade with the UK has just disappeared overnight. I think the real issue is that really the UK is the most to benefit in many ways. If we were to see the completion of the single market in services, the UK is specialised in business services, financial services. In many ways, the UK has the most to gain, and by leaving the EU and potentially the single market, it wouldn't get those benefits. And I suppose this is where maybe we'll get into some of the issues David Begg mentioned in terms of equality and so on. When I started economics, there was a consensus that there's a real puzzle around convergence in living standards, and of late, this attracted a lot of attention in terms of the distribution of income and wealth, books by the likes of Thomas Piketty. But over the last 10, 20 years, one of the untold stories has been the convergence of living standards. Places like China, India, seeing much more improvement. And while that's been great for those countries, we haven't seen perhaps some of those benefits in terms of the West, where there has been rising inequality. So these benefits of trade agreements, things like TTIP, the EU single market, they're just not appreciated on the ground, when in fact they actually are benefiting people. And econometric studies by people like myself are not going to convince people they are helpful. I think if you're in China or India, you'd be far more convinced on the merits of getting these trade barriers down. And that's just not really resonating with people at the moment here in Ireland, Europe, and potentially the US as well.
Conall MacCoille, thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank our panel now for their contributions, and I'd like to invite you, the audience now as well, to, if you have any questions for our panel, there'll be a roving microphone going around the place. We might, there's a gentleman down here. We'll go to the gentleman down here in a moment. Now, I'll maybe come to you first of all, Professor John McHale, as you kind of a gloomy outlook on this whole Brexit matter. Tell me, David McWilliams says it could be actually a very positive thing. You know, as Mary Harney once said, that we have closer ties to Boston than we do to Berlin, and surely we could be able to entice some foreign direct investment to this country if Britain were to leave the EU.
There would be certain benefits in competing for foreign direct investment, but the studies that have been done sort of indicate that by the UK making itself a less strong competitor in that market, that it would be other sort of larger markets that would gain most.
So we're talking about markets like the financial sector that would gain and that we'd lose in other sectors.
So the financial sector, I think, is probably one sector in which we would gain, and the word is that there's already sort of interest in moving certain activities to Ireland. So I think there would be some gains there. But as I said in my talk, I think the losses to the UK from FDI and the resulting income shock would have much bigger negative effects on Ireland than any gain that we would get from diversion. So I agree with Conall when he says that we're not looking at a doomsday scenario. So I think that is true. But if you look at the sorts of estimates of losses over a long period of time, and I think you're right in the sense it will take time for the trade links to unwind, but over a period of 15 years or more, you're looking at the loss of maybe 2 to 3 years of growth. So it's not doomsday, but it is still very significant, and that's a combination of the trade and foreign direct investment effects.
And John, maybe Conall, the NTMA were estimating that we could maybe get 6 billion, I think, of foreign direct investment, that we could entice around 6 billion to this country if Britain were to leave the EU. Is that a realistic figure?
No, I think it's a bit on the high side.
Is it, yeah?
If you look at a very high proportion that is in London, it's in the financial services sector. Many of these people are Davy's clients. And if you look at the financial sector here in Dublin, it tends to be mid-office and not the front office, where the revenue generators and the traders who don't necessarily have a great reputation are. So frankly, if you look at Dublin, the office space that's available is very, very little. If you look at, say, the City of London, it's an enormous market for commercial property. We could not even attempt to fit that amount of those people into the Dublin commercial property market. So,
and it's so tight,
it's just not going to happen. These people are going to move to Frankfurt or Paris. We might get a little bit of mid-office business, but it's certainly not going to be something that compensates us for the bigger macroeconomic effects.
Not as optimistic then as David McWilliams in that case. I'll come to this gentleman down here. He has a question for the panel. Who do you have a question for?
Not really a question, just a little comment. Just to make this point in general, that the word debate was used, but of course it wasn't a debate, and it's noticeable that everybody was very respectful, but even the ambassador, respectful of the fact that the British are the ones who are making the decision on the big day, not us here in this room or any of the members of the panel or even myself. But I have to make a view known. I am pro-Schengen. And the Schengen issue has been occupying me since we joined the European Union in 1973. Schengen didn't exist in those days, but it does now. And life was so easy in 1973, going anywhere to the Union, travelling on out-of-date passports, all sorts to carry on. No bother, we were very welcome in France. Brussels was a little bit hassly, but with Paris it was great. The one big point I want to make is that this week, or before the last government ended, we had a signature from the two governments signing up to an arrangement where from now on, we will be actually seeking permission to enter the United Kingdom before we leave Ireland, on the basis of having our passports scanned. Now, Aer Lingus and Ryanair, when they were asked about it, wouldn't say anything because they don't know what's going to happen. So we are, in fact, introducing, before Britain has even thought of leaving or voted on it, and I would be for it on that basis because I want to join Schengen. I would like to see the country within Schengen. But we signed up this arrangement now where we won't be able to enter Britain. There's also this imbalance between crossing the border, the land border into Northern Ireland is open, but crossing into Holyhead and travelling with Eurolines is an absolute nightmare, where you're taken off the bus by the police in the middle of the night, and then checked into Britain, and then checked out again when you're leaving Holyhead. Now that's, everybody gets checked. And as the police officer very courteously said to me, in spite of asking me was I a mental case, but I explained to him I didn't have ID. We don't have ID in Ireland as citizens of this country, nor do the British, the police have. And I explained to the officer, who was most courteous to me, that this was the situation. Anyway, that's the way things are.
That's a very interesting question because, thank you very much, sir. Mairéad McGuinness, the whole issue of the common travel, I mean, it's been touched upon here today. But realistically, if Britain were to leave the EU, what are we looking at? I mean, are we talking of hard physical borders with Northern Ireland again? I mean, are we going to have to be showing passports? What do you think will be the situation?
Well, I alluded to that in the short presentation. We just don't know. I think it will not be the same as it is today. I don't think it can be. But I think the bigger question, which has been touched on there, is I travel to Strasbourg once a month for the seat of the European Parliament. And up until the recent terrorist attacks, that was very easy. If I flew into Amsterdam and then on to Strasbourg, and no problems. Now there are checks. And it is quite a shock to the system, not so much for the Irish and British, because we have some border controls, than for the Schengen colleagues. So we have a real problem across Europe because of terrorism and where people are trying to protect national borders. And we hope that Schengen will operate more freely than it's currently doing. But I think there is an acknowledgement across all member states that there is a need for increased security. This is a disconnected answer from the topic of Brexit or not. To go to your core point, if there is a Brexit, there will be a period, I think you're right, it will be longer than 2 years because there's so much to discuss. But there will not be the same situation, I believe, on the island as there is today. I do not think, unless, and I hope I would be wrong, and I hope there isn't a Brexit, that life will be the same. But I come back to the core point. If the European Union involves 28 countries with common issues and agreements and whatever, and if somebody decides to go, it's because they don't want to be part of the club. So things change. The ground rules change, and that's the uncertainty that's impacting now and has yet to be decided on the other side of the 23rd of June.
Thank you, Mairéad. Another question here, another microphone here, thanks, and another one back here, cool. Thank you. We'll be wrapping this up in around 10 minutes, guys, so
okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a question from Mairéad, and it's on the politics of it. I suppose, a number of years ago we had concerns about Greece and the euro and whether they'd leave the euro or not, and to an extent this is very much the same question, just in a different context. What's your sense amongst your colleagues in Europe on the potential in other countries such as France? We're hearing of Holland or Netherlands kind of having concerns. Will there be momentum on that across Europe if the British do vote themselves out?
I think that I again mentioned this in the presentation because I mentioned the word shock, and I think there would be a political shock if the UK decides to leave. Maybe not a surprise, but definitely a political shock, because there are other countries, and David, you alluded to this, the changing political landscape across Europe, where traditionally, for example, in the European Parliament, the Social Democrats and the Centre-Right Party would be able to manage to bring forward and propose and get legislation adopted. We are seeing a sundering of, if you like, the traditions, and we're seeing that across individual member states. And there is across, and I don't have the figures, Noelle, you might have them, there are opinion polls would say that many countries would like to see them having a vote to stay or leave. So there will be consequences for other countries, whatever the outcome of the British referendum, and particular if it's a vote to leave. There is, unfortunately, and I regard it as quite a simplistic view, that the European Union is the cause of all our problems. In some countries, that is the view that the EU is the problem. If we could only get away from it, we won't have problems. And I think it's understandable because Europe can be a bit complex and certainly has been slow to take decisions on many issues and has been found wanting. But if that narrative persists, then we're going to have a scenario that you just paint. So there is an anxiety, I think, that it will cause other countries to wonder, well, if they go, why would we stay? And this is the big if. If there seem to be no consequences for a leave, and we're a bit uncertain about why we're in, then this perhaps could lead to other countries taking a similar route.
Thank you, Mairéad. There is a fear of a splintering of the EU. The gentleman in the front here has a question.
Yeah, for Noelle O'Connell, or perhaps the ambassador. I understand people, UK citizens abroad, are entitled to vote. What is the procedure for them to register? Was the cut-off date yesterday, or
you know what? I think this is one for you.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, I'll give my spiel, and the ambassador might correct me if I make an error. The Electoral Commission of the UK's recommended deadline was 5 o'clock yesterday, just in time in terms of getting the postal ballot papers. However, the hard deadline, the official deadline, is 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock on the 7th of June, okay? So the recommended deadline, which is why I was on Morning Ireland doing media around it, was so that overseas British voters, i.e. here in Ireland, that the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Registry offices would have enough time to get the ballot papers, and that they in turn, the people would have enough time to get the votes back. So the official answers, recommended deadline was yesterday. However, you do have until the 7th of June. If you are eligible to vote, go on to gov.uk/register to vote. Very simple process, only takes a couple of minutes. All the relevant information is there. And certainly, if you are eligible, do it sooner rather than later. Is that, Ambassador, do you want to have yeah.
Maybe a microphone. Do you want to stay? Come here. Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. No problem.
To be eligible to vote in the first place, you needed to have lived in the UK in the last 15 years and to be on the electoral roll in the last 15 years. There are 3 ways you could vote, in theory, as an overseas Brit. You can do it by flying back to your constituency and voting in person, or by appointing a proxy to vote on your behalf, or by a postal ballot. As Noelle says, it's probably now a bit late for a postal ballot. You won't be sure you'll get it back in time to send it again. So really there are 2 options left now for Brits. As long as they register by the 7th of June, either fly back, as lots of people did in the referendum here on same-sex marriage, and vote at home, or appoint someone to vote for you, if you can trust them to vote the right way, of course.
There's a lady here as well, and gentleman here. Okay.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'm a British and Irish citizen. I don't see how Europe has much to do with the relationship between Britain and Ireland. I've lived with this dichotomy my whole life. Britain and Ireland just get on and sort it out, maybe with a bit of help from America now and again. I don't see how being a member of the European Union affects any political relationships between the two countries. I'd like to understand why people think that. And also, I haven't decided how I'm going to vote, but I'm not voting. I'm not going to vote in the short term. I think there might be a recession in Britain and Ireland as a consequence, but you've got to think that this is the only referendum in my lifetime that's happened. So how is things going to happen? What will it look like in 40 or 50 years' time again? You know, there's no point voting on what's going on in the economic situation now. But I think if Europe really wanted Britain to be part of it, it would have engaged in the negotiations to make it a more democratic process. Europe isn't democratic, and that's, for me, what it comes down to.
Thank you.
Just like some comments on that.
Mairéad, yeah.
Perhaps the ambassador might want to intervene on this as well. Where do I begin? The democratic piece, I just did try to mention that. I suppose it depends on your definition, and I think perhaps the failure of the European Union has been to explain how the democracy works. I mean, ministers of all of the member states are involved, and elected representatives of all of the member states are involved in making the law. So that is democratic, and they have to go back to the national parliaments as well. So I suppose there is always that sense of a disconnect, but whether that is real or not, I think is open to question. It could be improved. I think sometimes the length we take to make legislation gives that sense of what are they talking about and why didn't they do it sooner. But I do think people perhaps need to understand that democratically elected ministers and opposition parties are involved in lawmaking in the member state, and that we as members of the European Parliament are involved. The question of the EU being more engaged, I mean, the United Kingdom is a member of the European Union. We're a smaller country. To some extent, we could say, gosh, there's fewer of us. There's 11 Irish members in the European Parliament. We don't have strength in our numbers. We have strength in our voice and in our ability to negotiate. And I think there are differences in how different countries negotiate. I do think that the Irish have a particular way, perhaps because we're smaller. So I think it's a two-way street when you're negotiating. I'm sorry that I'm overrunning. 40 years' time, I would think that if my only, and I won't ask and persuade you either way, is the nation state, countries on their own in Europe, better for the future? Or is the European Union, where nation states can work together collectively, better for the future? And I think for my children and their children, I believe that collective action amongst European member states is better, and therefore you need structures to do that. I don't like the idea that countries get picked off and they believe they're better on their own. I think that is quite a damaging process for a vision, and we do need a discussion about the vision, David. You're absolutely right. So I would be more fearful of, Denmark saying we're better off on our own, the French, led by the extreme right, saying we're better off on our own. And indeed, from an Irish point of view, I don't think that's a way forward.
Okay, thank you,
Just one point to add, one quick point to add. I think what's significantly important for us and Britain, as distinct from, say, some of the other small open economies in Europe, and we are a very, very open economy, and as such, we are very, if you like, vulnerable to, what happens in international trade and markets and all that type of thing. But countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, Finland to an extent, are all very close to Germany. A lot of those countries are definitely within the German sphere of influence. They tend to be sub-suppliers to German industry and so on. So Germany is very protective of them. It's worth remembering that way back 20 odd years ago, when we were in the exchange rate mechanism, and there was a whole thing about whether we should be there or whether we should be out of it. We were under speculative attack on the Pund and so on. That Germany defended the Danish kroner but didn't defend the Irish punt, right? It was a significant marker. On the other hand, we're quite important to Britain. We're Britain's 5th largest trading partner. We don't matter to Germany on a bilateral basis. No. So that is a significant point that we have to keep
So there
in
are
mind.
clubs within the EU, of course. And the gentleman here in the blue T-shirt. 2 final questions maybe now.
Okay. So to put things in perspective, with this migration crisis, over 1 million people were brought into Germany, in which seems to have been a unilateral decision by Angela Merkel. So far, the number of ISIS suspects discovered so far in Germany by the authorities is approximately the same size as the IRA was at its peak. And a lot of neighbouring countries around Germany don't want any part in this, and yet they are finding that the European Union is discussing imposing enormous fines on them if they don't participate. How can you justify that you're in a democratic situation there? It certainly doesn't seem to be satisfying people's right to self-determination. So that's just a question for anyone in the panel. It's not for anyone specific.
Yeah, well, as the ambassador alluded to, of course, the migration is one of the burning issues in this debate, in the referendum. John, I know you're on migration.
I think it's more politics.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just take that. There's 2 issues about this. One is my email. Every time there's a tragedy or a child dies from drowning, I get emails saying, why aren't you doing more? Why isn't Europe doing more? When I speak out in public about what more we need to do collectively, I get emails saying, we shouldn't be doing that much, let somebody else do it. The truth is we have a tragedy on our borders. Europe is not as badly impacted as Jordan and the Lebanon, where the Lebanon has taken in 25% of its population. It educates these children on double shifts in their schools and has real problems around integration and other issues. I could accept part of what you're saying. There is no doubt a lot of countries do not want Europe to tell them what to do. But what I would suggest is that we need a little bit more solidarity amongst the members of the European Union, not that they are told what to do, but that we can agree a common strategy on how to cope with the situation where we have obligations to refugees that cannot go back home because they will be killed. And Peter Sutherland has led on this debate. And the issue of fines is a proposal which many people reject. The Turkish deal is another proposal that people have concerns about. It is an imperfect solution to a crisis on our borders, and until we solve the Syrian war, we are going to continue to have this difficulty. Sorry for a length.
No, you're all right. Now, I'm going to keep this short. I'll take one question here and a question from the gentleman at the very back. Okay.
Actually, what I'll do is ask 2 very quick questions. The first question relates to Conall MacCoille's point about the long period of negotiation, and it's perhaps a legal question. The question is whether or not Ireland will be able legally to engage in a bilateral negotiation with the United Kingdom outside the European Union, or will Ireland be forced to work collectively in a larger bilateral negotiation between the entire remaining EU and the UK. And my final question would be to David Begg about the European social model. Now, the European social model has been declared dead by some very influential Europeans, and whether or not a German Europe is in fact no longer social, but perhaps ordo-liberal.
Okay, Conall, first question.
Take the first point, it's very quick. Basically, the EU will be taking care of our trade negotiations with the UK. And unless you believe we're going to leave the EU alongside the UK, which was actually put to me in an interview by someone from BBC Northern Ireland, which provoked laughter on my part. That's not going to happen, so the EU will be doing the trade agreement, and that's it. On migration, there's obviously no common EU migration policy, so we could do a deal with the UK where labour market access is preserved as it is, and the 2 governments can do that bilaterally, and that'll be fine. But basically, there's no. You sometimes hear people like UKIP say, "We'll do a deal with Ireland on trade." That's not going to happen.
Okay, the tea and coffee I know is being prepared. Well, I'll take one final question from the gentleman in the back.
Do you want me to answer that?
David. Oh, David,
question?
sorry, David.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think ordoliberalism works very well in Germany, right? Because it works in the context of an understanding which sets, if you like, economic efficiency and so on alongside social provision. It works well for the German people. They are bought into that. The problem is that when you export that model, it just presents as a very hard-nosed neoliberalism. The problem, I think, with the European social policy really is simply this. Within the European context, institutionally, the European Central Bank is extremely strong with a very limited remit of sound money and price stability. There are no social institutions of comparable status within Europe to balance that. So in theory, I stress theory because in practice Draghi I think has been quite good, but in theory there's no reason for the European Central Bank to be concerned about 25 million unemployed people in Europe. One of the reasons why there isn't a comparable social model is that social policy is still, to a large extent, a national competence. And you now have 27, 28 separate systems. So there's no possibility of getting an agreed central position. And some of that is from reasons you wouldn't expect. Take the Nordic countries, for instance, that have the best social model in Europe, would not want that centralised because it would diminish it in terms of what their expectations are. But our problem is that we're in that dichotomy, if you like, I think. Personally, the only route I can see out of it is to change the remit of the ECB and make it more like the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, where it is required to take cognizance of, general economic policy and general issues such as employment in the economy and so on. Now, up to now, the Germans would have been very opposed to that, but given their current tensions between Wolfgang Schäuble and Mario Draghi about the ECB's quantitative easing and so on, maybe eventually there'll be an easing up on that. But it's some accommodation like that we need, because if you don't get that, the popular support for Europe won't be there. And I might be wrong about this, Mairéad, but my understanding is that the last time that social Europe was discussed in the Parliament was back in 2006.
We had a debate recently on employment with the Commissioner, so no, it comes up in debate
but
on employment.
The concept, you know what I mean,
even
has sort of
sorry
been
to have a
marooned
chat, if you don't mind. We're with the centre-right, the EPP. We talk about the social market economy all the time, but I do think that after, maybe we should come back and do a debate.
Yeah, we have tea and coffee as well, so there'll be a lot of time to discuss it. That's all right. Kirsten Owen, he said it's fad, and then we're wrapping it up because I know people are getting trains and buses back home again. So the gentleman at the back, one.
Yeah, if Britain votes to leave, but Scotland overwhelmingly votes to remain, does the Scottish independence question come up again?
Yeah, that's been raised, hasn't it?
Ambassador.
The ambassador.
Saved by the ambassador.
Well, the answer is it will, because the Scottish National Party have said it will.
Yes.
So Mrs. Sturgeon has made it clear that in those circumstances, that would justify a change of situation that, in her view, would bring into play again the prospect of a second referendum. Whether the Scottish National Party would actually seek a second referendum, I think, is a further question, because I think they would not me, but I mean, political analysts in the UK are saying that if they were to lose 2 referendums on independence in quick succession, then that really would banish the idea of independence for the foreseeable future. So I think they would only call a second referendum if they were pretty clear they were going to win it, and they would need the opinion polls then to be showing a very strong lead for independence for a considerable period of time to be confident of winning, and that's not the position at the moment. So I think, it will come back into play, but whether actually it would precipitate a referendum will will depend more actually on what public opinion polls are showing in Scotland at the time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, just maybe a quick whip around, guys, at the panel. I'm going to ask you to call it. What's going to happen on June 23rd? Professor McHale, will they remain or will they go?
I think the case is so strong for Remain that hopefully sanity will prevail, but I wish I was more confident.
Okay. Mairéad?
Níl is a gum.
Yeah.
I hope that from the debates I've watched on television, that there is a real people are thinking in the United Kingdom more deeply about membership of the European Union, and that they will be convinced themselves to stay in and change from within.
David Begg, what do you think 36 days to go?
I think the Remain side will shade it just about, but won't settle the issue. That's the problem. That's why I argue that Ireland needs to think in a 10-year, 15-year framework about how we reorientate ourselves to be more involved with the Eurozone.
Okay. Noelle?
I'm a cautious optimist. I change every time I see the opinion poll, but it's rare that I'm ever on the side of the bookies. But the bookies in this one have it very strongly at Remain. I obviously I hope that it's Remain, but I think if the turnout, and particularly the turnout among the younger generation, you've 220,000 young people who are going to be in Glastonbury, so if youth turnout isn't high, I fear.
And Conall?
And well, you just robbed my best line. The bookies have had it constantly 2-1 in favour of staying. So there was analysis that there's about 20% undecided, roughly, in all the polls. And if you look at the Scottish referendum vote and also the election last year, the undecideds tend to go to status quo. Maybe that's less true this time, but certainly that's the way the thinking has been. Also, the phone polls have a consistent majority in favour when they speak to people, whereas the internet polls, which maybe attract a slightly different breed of person, tend to have it more finely balanced. So I think on balance, looking at all of that, you'd have to say it's more likely that they'll vote to stay in.
That they will stay. Well, that's where we're going to have to leave it, unfortunately. My thanks to the panel today, to Professor McHale, Mairéad McGuinness, David Begg, Noelle O'Connell, and Conall MacCoille, Míle Maggie. Thanks too to the British Ambassador, Dominic Chilcott, to whom we wish all the best in his next posting. To the President of NUI Galway, Dr. Jim Brown, to everybody who came here today to listen, to learn, to ask questions. Special thanks to the staff of NUI Galway, to the British Embassy in Ireland, with support from European Movement Ireland, who organised today's event. Go dtugad dia slán ó bhaile si bar fad, slán ag spannacht.